listening to what he had written. What he was hoping for me is to, take the weight off my shoulders, of the world off my shoulders, and, to find love and to be happy in life.
The world knows Paul McCartney as the genius behind some of the greatest songs ever written. But few know the painful truth that haunted his relationship with Julian Lennon for decades. At 62, Julian is finally pulling back the curtain on the bond he shared with Paul and the dark shadow it cast over his life. What started as an act of kindness became both a blessing and a lifelong burden, tied to one of the most famous songs in history. Why did Paul's gesture leave scars that never fully faded? And what secret truth about Paul does Julian now dare to reveal? Join us as we uncover the dark truth that 62-year-old Julian Lennon finally revealed about Paul McCartney. The Forgotten Son. Most people are completely unaware of the impact Paul McCartney had on Julian Lennon's life. At the moment Julian needed care and guidance the most, Paul swooped in like a guardian angel, filling a void left by Julian's father. While the world celebrated the Beatles, few noticed the small, fragile child struggling behind the scenes, and even fewer realized that Paul had stepped up to change his life forever. Julian Lennon was born at the very moment his father, John Lennon, was on the cusp of becoming a famous musician. Immediately, his early childhood unfolded in a strange parallel reality. While other children had fathers who walked them to school or read bedtime stories, his father was constantly on the road, performing in stadiums, going on tours, or hiding from paparazzi. The Beatles' success grew at lightning speed, and with it, John's commitment to family shrank. Cynthia Powell, John's first wife and Julian's mother, carried the weight of normal life alone. She worked tirelessly to provide Julian with stability in a world that was anything but stable. But she also bore the heavy humiliation of being forgotten. Still, she held on to hope that one day John would return to her. But little did she know what was coming. John met Yoko Ono in 1968, and their instant connection was all it took for John to end his marriage to Cynthia. The split was brutal. Even though John was one of the wealthiest musicians alive, he completely kicked his old family out of his life, forcing them to struggle to cover basic needs. Fame brought fortune, but none of it seemed to trickle down to the people he left behind. For Julian, the collapse of his family was soul-crushing. At 5 years old, he was suddenly without the most important figure in his life. It was bad enough that he didn't see him all day, but to see John's face splashed across magazines while knowing he wouldn't show up at home was a cruel fate no child should endure. What made it worse was the confusion. Nobody explained why his father was gone or how to cope with the sudden emptiness. Millions adore him because of his name and association with his father. Yet in reality, Julian felt abandoned. He needed love and reassurance, but if his own father couldn't give him that, who could? The kind uncle's intervention. Amid the chaos, one man noticed the small, broken family left in John Lennon's wake. Paul McCartney, John's closest collaborator and fellow Beatle, made a choice that others didn't. He refused to turn his back on Cynthia and Julian. While fame pulled John further into his new world, Paul drove quietly to the doorstep of his bandmates' abandoned family. Paul's visit was not for show. That was obvious by the lack of photographers and headline news. Paul just wanted to be there for them. So he sat and ate with them, and then he began to play with Julian. For once since her divorce, Cynthia could feel relieved as she watched her son laugh. That visit was the first of many more. Paul had stepped into the role of a surrogate father, filling the space John had left empty and giving Julian the attention a growing boy needed to be happy and disciplined. What makes this even more striking is that Paul's relationship with John was far from simple. They were creative partners with a friendship built on love and respect, yes, but also rivals locked in an unspoken battle for dominance within the Beatles. John sometimes mocked Paul for being too sentimental, while Paul bristled at John's carelessness with people's feelings. So when Paul learnt that John's carelessness had affected his own family, he decided to step up and do for Julian what John should have done himself. And in doing so, he revealed the difference in their characters. It was during these long, thoughtful drives to see Cynthia and Julian that Paul began to feel even more empathetic. He wanted to comfort the boy, but struggled to find the right words. How could he explain heartbreak to a child? How could he assure Julian that life could still be beautiful even when the most important person in his world had walked away? This was the spark of what would become one of the most famous songs ever written, and it all began with a man who cared enough to notice the pain others ignored. But how could a single song capture the weight of a child's heartbreak and promise him hope? A Broken Boy's Ballad. In 1968, Paul McCartney sat behind the wheel of his car, driving toward Cynthia and Julian's home, when an idea surfaced in his mind, and that idea would change music forever. Paul began to hum. The tune was simple at first, but it was about the warmth and reassurance he could not put into words. Slowly, he built it into a song. He called it Hey Jules, directly naming Julian in the title. The opening words formed like a gentle hand on a child's shoulder. Hey Jules, don't make it bad. Take a sad song and make it better. Over time, Paul decided to change the title from Jules to Jude. He thought it rolled off the tongue more smoothly, and he wanted the message to feel broader. With the change, the song transformed into something that spoke not just to Julian, but to anyone carrying pain. When Paul brought Hey Jude to the rest of the Beatles, they could all recognize its potential. Even though the song broke all the rules by being more than 7 minutes long, the unforgettable melody was all they needed to give it a go. So they recorded it, and in August 1968, the single was released. Paul was happy that Julian could now get to listen to the song whenever he wished to, but he didn't know that within weeks it would be topping charts across the world. The song reminded people to stay hopeful even when life seemed to collapse. It became more than entertainment, and critics even hailed it as one of the Beatles' greatest achievements. But the song was never really about public consumption. Instead, it was the soundtrack of Julian's childhood heartbreak, which raises the question that if the world saw a song of healing, what did Julian truly hear when those famous chords began to play? An unintended curse. For most people, music is a comfort. A favorite song can feel like a friend, returning again and again to lift the spirit or soothe a wound. But for Julian Lennon, one of the most famous songs in history became something else entirely, a shadow that followed him everywhere he went. Hey Jude was written to heal him, yet it became the very thing he could never escape. The song's monumental success meant that Julian could not simply tuck it away as a private memory. It was not just a family story behind closed doors, it was a global anthem that was still sung in stadiums decades later. As he grew older, journalists constantly reminded him of the song's origin. Fans asked him what it felt like to be the boy behind Hey Jude. Every interview seemed to circle back to the same subject, forcing him to revisit the pain of his parents' collapse. Even when Julian tried to carve out a career of his own by releasing albums and writing songs, the shadow of Hey Jude loomed large. This fame without choice shaped his relationship with the song into something complicated. Julian once admitted that he had a love-hate relationship with the song. That phrase captured the paradox perfectly. Love, because the song was a testament to the kindness of Paul, a man who stepped in when his real father stepped out. Hate, because the melody tied him forever to the darkest chapter of his life. Every time it played, the wound reopened. The song was both a gift and a curse. As the years passed, Julian's struggle with Hey Jude mirrored his broader struggle with his own identity. He could never fully escape his father's shadow. Even when he achieved success as a musician with hits like Too Late for Goodbyes in the 1980s, he was still measured against the Beatles' legacy, still compared to the man who had abandoned him. The public fascination with Hey Jude only deepened that sense of being trapped in a narrative he did not choose. In 2022, after decades of living with that shadow, Julian did something extraordinary. He released an album called Jude. Naming it after the very song that defined him was not an act of surrender, but of reclamation. It was as if he had finally decided to confront the ghost head-on, to claim ownership of the story that had haunted him since childhood. The title was a statement. This is who I am, not just the boy in Paul's song, not just the forgotten son of a Beatle, but an artist and a man in his own right. Still, even in this act of reclamation, the paradox remained. The song followed him, a famous shadow he could neither fully embrace nor completely escape. It was the anthem of hope that reminded him of hopelessness. It was the gift of comfort that brought discomfort. The melody that once promised healing became the shadow he could neither fully embrace nor escape. And so the question remained, could any act of ownership truly free him from the song that defined a life he never chose? Icon or hypocrite? As the years rolled on, the gap between Julian Lennon and his father didn't close. In fact, it widened until it became an unbridgeable chasm. For the public, John Lennon was everywhere, a cultural icon, a man whose face was splashed across newspapers, whose voice was heard in protests and rallies, and whose every word seemed to carry the weight of a generation. But for Julian, he was nowhere. His father's absence was not simply a childhood phase, it was a constant condition of life. Soon enough, Julian was old enough to notice the irony of his father's life. He saw the news stories that praised John for standing against war and violence. He heard strangers call his father a hero for singing about love. Yet, behind closed doors, Julian had to watch his mother nurse her broken heart for years. The hypocrisy stung. The hypocrisy stung. The wound deepened even further with the arrival of Julian's half-brother, Sean. When Sean was born in 1975, John reinvented himself as the perfect father. He stepped away from his career to become a devoted stay-at-home parent. He read bedtime stories and described himself proudly as a house husband. Fans and journalists were proud of him and celebrated the new Lennon as though he had finally discovered the true meaning of love. What they did not realize was that there was another son, now a teenager, who was watching from the sidelines. Julian could not miss the contrast. They had heard that John was earning millions from record sales, and even the world assumed mother and son were being taken care of. Still, his mother sometimes had to cut coupons while budgeting every penny so they could survive, all while the world saw John Lennon as a peacemaker and devoted father to Sean. Julian himself articulated this conflict in devastatingly simple words. He admitted that his father's image felt false to him. He described John as someone who preached one thing and lived another. The bitterness was not only about the past, but also about the constant, inescapable comparisons. Whenever Sean was photographed with John, it felt like a reminder of what Julian never had. And in the background of all of this remained the song, Hey Jude. While the world saw it as a timeless promise of comfort, the song stood in direct opposition to Julian's reality. The lyrics told him things would get better, yet life did not. Instead, the wound remained, growing deeper with every passing year. If the world never stopped to question the difference between John's words and his actions, who would ever see the forgotten child left behind? A new reclaimed identity. As the years stretched on, Julian began to do something remarkable. He turned a story of being left behind into one of moving forward. His first major step toward independence came through music. In the 1980s, when he released his debut album, Veloute, critics were startled. Here was a voice that carried an uncanny resemblance to John's, but the songs carried a gentleness that only Julian could portray. But music was only one avenue. Where John had chosen fame, Julian sought solace through quieter arts. He turned to photography, capturing landscapes and fleeting moments of human intimacy, and his exhibitions traveled across cities. And then there was his philanthropy. In 2007, Julian founded the White Feather Foundation, inspired by a memory of his father telling him that if he ever passed, he would send a white feather as a sign of peace. One day, Julian received such a feather from an Australian Aboriginal elder, and from that moment, the foundation grew, funding projects in clean water, environmental preservation, and health across the globe. Suddenly, Julian was no longer just the child who lived through neglect. He had become a man who reached out to ensure no child, no family, and no community would feel forgotten in the way he once had. Because in giving to others, he healed himself. What made Julian's path different from his father's was not just the art, but the way he chose to carry on memory. While John Lennon was immortalized in martyrdom, Julian never had that luxury. He bore his scars openly, but he refused to let them become excuses. Over the years, he spoke about the pain and created a balance between honesty and resilience. Julian Lennon's healing was not about erasing the past. It was about rewriting its power. He did not forget the child who sat by a window, waiting for a father who never came. He did not deny the sting of being left out of the storybook, ending the public imagined for the Beatles' families. Instead, he carried that truth into his adulthood, molding it into music, art, and even humanitarian work that touched lives far beyond his own. The question that lingers is not whether Julian ever escaped his father's legacy. Perhaps no child of a Beatle truly can, but whether he found a way to transform that legacy into something uniquely his. In the end, the answer seems clear. Julian Lennon became more than Hey Jude. He became Julian. What do you think about Julian's broken past? Do you think Paul McCartney should have kept the song private instead? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.